So hopefully everybody can see our slideshow today. Today we're going to be talking about student learning assessment in the larger assessment scheme that your office undertakes. So what we're going to be doing is asking, beyond preparing students pragmatically for their programs abroad, how can we also ensure that students are aware of and more intentional about the learning they're going to undertake while they're away? We're going to go through a couple of frameworks and tools to assess all of these elements of student growth. And hopefully you'll have some opportunities to share with one another some of what you do as well.
So good morning again. It's still morning here on the East Coast. We have a few more minutes of that. Welcome to the Assessing Student Growth and Development session. So for the next 90 minutes, we'll be focusing on our students, and not in the way that is sometimes imposed on us as a metric of our success. That is, we're not talking about student numbers, but on their individual learning and growth and development from every angle in a way that we can document as a result of their participation in our programs. So first, during this session, Gabe will take you through a process of framing to show you what we mean by student assessment in study abroad programs. And we'll also consider why we should be assessing student learning. We'll also look at what other study abroad programs are doing, and then ask you to reflect on your own practices and share with colleagues in small groups. We'll be asking you to record your comments and ideas so that at the end of your group discussions, we can share with the larger group. During the second part of the session, we'll look at some examples of tactics, tools, and techniques you may consider as you develop your assessment plan. So we'll explore everything from whys, whats, and hows, including where to start assessing and when to end. But as like Tiffany was showing in the last session, it's a cycle. It's a never-ending cycle, so we just start all over again. Then we'll also, as in the first half, we'll ask you to reflect and discuss in small groups you have to any ideas you have to strengthen or develop your assessment plan. And we'll report out the highlights so that everyone can benefit from this idea generation. So remember, this is a 90-minute session. We'll be going nonstop, after which we'll have a 30-minute break before our next session, evaluating your program and assessing institutional partnerships. So let's start with Gabe. He will get us kicked off on this journey.
All right, hold on, everybody. It's a slideshow time. So today, what we want to talk about is a little bit about framing student learning at a conceptual level. While we'll be talking about framing student learning assessment tools in our segment on tactics, tools, and techniques, we wanted to spend a little bit of a time sort of zooming out and thinking about what is our conceptualization of student learning as a whole. So when we talk about student learning at the overlap of study abroad and student affairs, student life, the metrics we're assessing tend to fall into three buckets: intercultural competence, academic learning, especially as all of our students are engaging in some form of academic learning during their study abroad programs, and then student identity development, sort of at the core. So the image that you see here, the set of three concentric circles, positions those buckets really in relation to one another. This graphic is an adaptation of a Spheres of Influence activity from the authors of Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, and helps us see a few key things. Some of the most immediate pieces that we often assess are these intercultural competencies, language learning skills, seeing how much of that academic content they actually retain during their shenanigans away. And at the same time, something that I often see missed in assessments or in student perception of assessments is understanding the student learning that students are doing about themselves. We kind of touch on it in general ways, but by a show of hands, how many folks have spoken with a student who's from a group that might have, who might be LGBTQ, or a student of color, or someone who's like, I just didn't feel that my experience was captured or supported in my program? Has that happened for folks in conversations with students? All right, I'm seeing some hands. Absolutely. So I think making sure that we have the student identity development component as part of our understanding of student learning in this process means that we can capture data that will help us adapt our programs, and make sure that students are feeling heard, and shouting out these programs to one another as a place where they can be supported through their journey through your college or university. So yeah, if we're not incorporating that understanding, we're just missing so much important data. So we're going into the next session with a very holistic framework on that front.
Yes, thank you, Gabe. So why do we assess student learning? We all may have different answers for that. I mean, we all are, for the most part, we're doing end of program surveys of students to collect feedback, and this kind of feedback, positive testimonials, especially from our students, helps us to market and recruit more effectively. They help us to articulate the program to prospective students and to the world to show that our institution is offering many types of learning experiences. But if we're mainly focusing on student satisfaction, those responses are not necessarily showing us what our students are actually learning. And as Tiffany was mentioning earlier, we're all part of an educational institution here. So we need to align our assessment strategy to student learning outcomes. So documenting the student academic learning and the personal growth, I mean, because this is more of a holistic type of assessment, will give us validation to our programs and show that we're contributing to student success, and could be in the form of student retention and in so many other ways. So by learning outcome, we mean what a student should know and demonstrate and or be able to do after the completion of the program. So an example is after the program, the student is able to analyze and write about differing perspectives of their home and host cultures on like a specific social issue. Or after the program, a student could use appropriate communication styles of the host country to engage in formal debate. Or another example could be more personal, for example, to show growth or development, such as the student demonstrating they're able to describe their own cultural biases. So some of these learning outcomes can be self-reported by the student, but then they should also be corroborated by other forms of assessment that we'll talk about later, such as academic assignments through coursework during the program, or feedback from an internship supervisor or professor, et cetera. And we'll also share more written examples and a process that can help you write student learning outcomes that are in line with your program's objectives. So for now, we're going to be sharing a link to an anonymous poll, and I see Amy has put that in the chat. And we're going to ask you to complete that. It just has one question. Does your organization have an assessment plan that measures achievement of student learning outcomes? And we're asking you to just check one. We have a completed assessment plan for study abroad programs. Our assessment plan is in progress, but not completed, or we do not have an assessment plan for our study abroad programs. And we'll take it over to you, Gabe, to see what people came up with.
All right, so I'll give folks, excuse me, a minute to complete that poll, and we'll just switch over to that screen. Oh. So, I love it.
Wow.
Okay, all right. We've got a good range of responses. Lots of folks in progress. I love this because, we can always, it's always nice to hear that other folks are in the same boat we're all paddling together, trying to put together this assessment plan as our students are off elsewhere doing all kinds of things, and we're assessing at the same time. So this is great. This is great. I'll switch us back to our presentation view. But you know, this does happen to follow with trends in the current state of assessment. So this data is from the Forum on Education Abroad's last State of the Field assessment, when the field was not impacted by COVID in 2018. And really, from what we saw from that report, put out in 2018 by data from 2017, only about 21% of participating institutions had identified learning outcomes at all. Only about 27% had a comprehensive or general assessment plan. And for the most part, when people are talking about what evaluations they are doing, they're usually after the program has completed, or even annually, or even at more periodic intervals. So we've got this pretty much tracks with what we're hearing about. Folks have some level of an assessment plan, or are working on developing another one.
Great, and this continues looking at the current state of assessment. Also, again, with data from the Forum on Education Abroad State of the Field report published a few years ago. So what this chart shows is the most frequently reported assessment instruments used to measure student learning outcomes in study abroad programs. So you can see, starting from the left, we can see standard language tests that can measure, language proficiency. But then moving along, you can see the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. This is a test that measures how people tend to think and feel about cultural differences. There's also the GPI, more or less at the same level. It's the Global Perspectives Inventory that focuses on global student learning outcomes. And then there's the BEVI, Beliefs, Events, Values Inventory, that evaluates basic openness and global engagement, such as being receptive to different cultures and religions, et cetera. There are costs associated with these types of off-the-shelf assessments, and they are administered at the beginning and the end so that they can measure movement or change or transformation. And there are certainly many more, but these are the ones that are most widely used at the moment. What's interesting about this chart is the last two items that are other and not applicable. Many respondents indicated in the comments that they're using their own in-house survey or evaluation. So it's clear that currently this is still the preferred choice in most study abroad offices. So we hope that whatever combination of assessment tools that your office uses, you continue to refine and customize it to get the most valid and relevant data about student learning outcomes that are important to you. So far, in these last few minutes, we've been sharing thoughts on what we mean by student learning outcomes, why you should consider measuring them, and what are some of the general trends across the country to assess student learning outcomes. Now we'd like to start exploring what all of you can start doing or continue doing. It may seem daunting because there's so much one can do. So I would advise you to keep it simple, start with small steps, as that can lead to major progress before you know it. So I'm turning this back over to Gabe, who'll be helping us think about where to start.
Right. So for a more holistic assessment, let's diversify our assessment tools from just using end-of-program surveys. Mixed methods, i.e. both qualitative and quantitative approaches, allow us to capture a range of experiences and give us easy entry points into collaborations with campus partners, because you're also not the only person doing assessment on your campus, which we'll talk about in our next session. You can also use the assessment data that you've gathered to collaborate with a range of offices, or get data from them about some of the students potentially that are coming through your program. So if you're in conversations with your academic affairs offices, are there changes that they've noticed about participants who have studied abroad? Are they capturing that data at all on their end? These are all opportunities for collaboration with other offices, including the examples here given of student life and leadership and career development, just a few that could really lead to fruitful discussions and conversations across your offices.
That's great. So now we're going to start an individual reflection activity. We're about to divide you into small breakout groups for a discussion about your study abroad program office and its connection to your larger college or university. But first, we'd like you all to take about 3 minutes to reflect on the following questions that you see here, and perhaps write down responses for yourself. So what are some of the ways that your institution assesses social, emotional, professional growth outside of your division or office? So as previously mentioned, this could be like a student services or student life office or institutional research office, career planning center, could even be academic in your academic programs as well. And then the second is, how do the learning goals of your program connect with institutional mission and goals? So we'll consider this in quiet reflection for the next few minutes, and then Gabe will help you get into your breakout groups.
So for a few minutes, we just wanted to take a second to go through some of the major themes that we noticed in your slides as you were putting them together. And of course, you have access to these slides throughout the conversation. So if you want to take a peek during the breaks to see what other folks are reporting in terms of the tools and strategies they use, please feel free to do so. Yeah, Roberto, is there anything that really stood out for you as we were taking a look through the conversation?
One thing is that I saw that people are reporting that offices across campus are siloed, and so maybe there's not a lot of communication between or among them to really coordinate sharing or collecting data.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a familiar refrain, I think, for folks
Yes.
here. I'm seeing a lot of nods. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
It also looks like there's a range of where folks are in terms of what they're assessing specifically. Some people were developing intercultural assessment. Some folks were kind of doing that basic level of assessment tools. There were a couple campus partners named too.
Yeah, good. Another thing I noticed was that data was being collected, but perhaps not analyzed or implemented in any way with any kind of development of an action plan.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think would also typical too.
Yeah. And just to name a few of the tools for folks who are looking for ones to utilize on your own campuses, some of the ones that we saw, Qualtrics was named, some folks named language proficiency tests, the GPI like we had listed before, and program requirements as related to the academic courses or institutions that students were moving through.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that takes us as a nice segue into our next chunk. I'll move us on. So sorry, had my screen sharing paused.
No, great.
Those were our major themed. And those are tactics, tools, and techniques.
Yes. So now we're really at the midpoint of our session. And in tactics, tools, and techniques, we're just revisiting our initial question really here on the slide is, how do we go beyond evaluating our student satisfaction, begin to assess academic, social, emotional, and professional growth? What are the steps that we take? And we have a few highlights there in bullet points below. But I would go back to something that Tiffany was saying earlier about before you even start to dive in to step one, just ask yourself, really, why am I doing this? What do I want to achieve with all this information? And think about all your different audiences, not just, obviously the students that you're assessing, but also the people that who will be reviewing the results. So, those are things important to consider. But in terms of institutional program goals, like as we said, we're all part of an institution of higher learning whose mission is dedicated to, education, learning. So what are our programs doing to support that? Then from those goals, we would want to be drafting measurable learning outcomes. We want to have a series of SMART learning outcomes. So SMART as in specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-based. You all know this. To say what are the knowledge, skills, competencies that students are expected to have upon successful completion of the program. And as we note here, utilizing a learning process framework. I know Gabe will talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but we are urging or encouraging you to consider incorporating a program design that integrates assessment into learning so that it becomes a little more seamless. Your learning goals are then more aligned with your program activities. So, and along with that, you'll also want to use the appropriate assessment tools and strategies aligned with your learning outcomes. And we saw, like in your notes, in your breakout rooms, that some people were mentioning about the siloed effect on campuses, and we all recognize that as a common phenomenon. But we do try to change that. We'd urge you to try to change that. So one of the benefits of working at a college or university is, there are a lot of people around who are specialists in a lot of different fields, including assessment. So, we urge you to walk around campus, get to know your institution research colleagues or friends at Student Life or Career Center staff, who also tend to access and use a lot of student data. Obviously, even in the academic programs, like talking to professors, about classes, and who knows, I've seen this kind of win-win situation happen. They may want to assign their students to work with you on a project to help research and develop your assessment plan. Because we know that some of you work in offices that don't exactly have lots of staff resources. We also list here identifying points in the program to assess, ideally before, during, and after the program. So if you're only doing assessment at the end, you won't really be able to track any change. Also, I think another important benefit of starting with assessment at the beginning is, and involving your students at that time, really helps them frame their mindset of being in a learning experience. Remember that the student motivations for registering for your study abroad program may not be in alignment with learning goals, so you may have to guide them to get on track. So I'm going to invite Gabe to be saying a little bit more about that now. About learning
Absolutely.
process.
Yeah, we love a good framework. And in this field, I've just noticed so many various triangle-shaped diagrams for how we learn. We build Maslow's, Bloom's. Here's Bloom's taxonomy as a framework. So many of you may be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, which is a framework that categorizes educational goals in this sort of additive shape. The notion is that student starts at the foundational skill of being able to recall certain facts, and over the course of participation in college or university, they get to the point where they're producing new or original work. And while that's an interesting and foundational place to start thinking about student learning goals, I think we can start thinking a little bit more expansively about how our students experience the world around them and experience their academic context. Apologies. You might be hearing some ambient noise from outside my window. So this other graphic that I've uplifted here is the medicine wheel model, popularized by Marcelo Lefevre in 2016, and we'll have these sources available to you at the end of the presentation and, of course, at the end of the day as well. It's named as such because it's adapted from traditional indigenous ways of learning and knowing that are captured in the image of the medicine wheel. And what you see here is that it's a different shape from the triangle. It's sort of moving from the outside of the circle of skills inwards. And you're seeing key words here. So when you're developing the language for your assessment tools, are you incorporating these for any range of types of learning? So we see here in this particular model a physical, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual learning that coming together to create a sense of balance for your learner. Are there ways that you're investigating all of those facets through your assessment tools to make sure you're painting a holistic picture of the student experience and the learner experience throughout your program?
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that's helpful for adapting a more expansive framework is that we really it allows us to parse out the effects of our study abroad programs on students from a range of backgrounds, rather than assuming that everyone's starting from a sort of blank slate. You may be working with heritage travelers, right, who are from a diasporic community in your country, traveling elsewhere to get a sense of their heritage, their family heritage in another country. That's already starting from a different intercultural baseline than other students who may only have domestic U.S. experience or may have particular domestic U.S. experiences, right? So having a more, it helps us really assess differently for all of the students who are coming in from maybe non-traditional students studying abroad who are coming in from different, learning backgrounds and frameworks, that capturing in a generic, like, how good are you at listening to people from other cultures? Like, what does that actually mean? So frameworks like this help us parse that out a little bit more and dig a little bit deeper to create better experiences, better learning experiences for our students throughout their time in our programs.
Great. Thank you, Gabe. So formative and summative assessments, what do we mean by that? Some of you may be familiar with these terms, but if not, we have tried to briefly define them there. So formative assessment tools or activities, that refers to measuring ongoing student learning. So obviously it's happening during the program. And the summative assessments capture learning at the end of an event or a program. So both of these are important. We cannot do only one of these. I understand how hectic it is during a program to pause and reflect and assess. But if you only rely on your post-program assessment, what does that really tell you about learning outcomes as a result of participating in your program? Because you don't really have the baseline from where they started, or even any kind of monitor of their ongoing process during the program. So this slide here lists some tools and activities that can be implemented as formative or summative assessment tools. You see, we have a pre-program, program duration, post-program. And then we have activities that are listed under pre or post program, and we also have qualitative, quantitative. But I want to emphasize that these are just exemplary. They're not only really exclusive to one category. I would say it depends on how you're designing your activities and or let's say questions. For example, you've surely seen or even designed surveys that ask a mix of open-ended qualitative questions or questions that maybe ask for a single answer on a 5-point Likert scale. So that would be a more of a quantitative type of an assessment. So what we're encouraging really you to do is consider a mix of the type of assessment tools and the times during the program that they're administered. So like thinking about getting a baseline program of where our students are at the beginning, hopefully we have all our program materials, our brochures, our website, the general information you send to your prospective applicants. Hopefully all these are really explicit about learning outcomes. And then you can also reinforce that during advising sessions with applicants. And even your application process may draw information about where your students are with respect to their knowledge, skills, awareness. And before they even start, you may set up a type of learning contract with them and monitor their progress toward reaching their goals. Another way is to use rubrics. You'll see rubrics mentioned on this slide as a tool at every stage. And you may be using these, but if not, talk to colleagues, your professors about them, as they're often used with students in courses. So basically what a rubric is like a scoring guide to measure progress toward a specific goal. So for example, regarding cultural self-awareness, a starting point may be when someone has no awareness of cultural influence on their own attitudes or perspectives. And then maybe after more exposure, they may move to another level where they begin to recognize some cultural biases and preferences, and then on to feeling more comfortable with difference and maybe even adopting some shifts in the way they see and experience the world. So working with a tool like a rubric from the beginning can help students become more aware and deliberate about their learning process. So as a formative assessment tool, it's contributing to their learning while also assessing it. And as I said, learning contracts could also be similar as well as other tools. So now what we'd like you to do is to consolidate further all this information in a way that you can begin to apply it. And I'm turning over to Gabe again for another reflection activity.
Yeah, well, just to make a note a little bit about this slide before we jump back into reflection, I think that what I appreciate about sort of what you've shared, Roberto, and what we have in this slide here is that there are things that you might not have been conceptualizing as assessment tools, assessment opportunities. So how are you combing your advising session notes to serve as a data point for that pre-program assessment? This doesn't have to involve creating entirely new systems for every phase. It can also involve, wait, what are we already doing that we can do to, assess what folks are at? And I think I'm thinking about some of the like program and post-program things that are more qualitative. How can you even reimagine your qualitative pieces to hold and ask more specific questions of the student experience? So if you're saying, I'd like you to write 3 blog posts over your time there, from what I've noticed, students tend to highlight, this is when I climbed this mountain, and this is when I had this, conversation in the market. But, are there times when we're asking them like, hey, can you map out your community in your host, either with your host family or in your cohort? Can you map your community at different stages of your program to see, are you reaching a level of saturation with the local community, or are your students tending to stay in the same circles of sort of expat, communities, English speaking, possibly communities in their placements? I think that there are a lot of ways to think a little bit differently about what we already have in terms of blog posts, blog about who's moved in and out of your circles over the last 3 months. What is that experience for you? And working with students, if you're at a advisor, program coordinator level, are you working with students to help them articulate pieces that might be more challenging? People don't always volunteer, and they don't need to feel forced to volunteer the challenging parts of their experiences, but making sure that the door is open for them can create a stronger relationship of trust with your students in your office and lead to real and different outcomes. And just to also highlight for the program duration, how are you looping in your program, your site leaders? If you're working with organizations that with groups on the ground already, or with faculty who are leading programs, how are you inviting them to provide periodic reflections on their student experiences. I think these are all great places to start adopting holistic language in your assessment tools to make sure that, like I said, all the students who are holding some marginalized identity or who might be just having a straight up challenging time can at least feel like somewhere that's being caught by the institution and can also be used to develop things in the future. So I'll hop to our next piece, unless, well, Roberto, was there anything else you wanted to sort of chime in there? Because we've sort of gone back and forth about how tools can manifest for us.
Yeah, no, let's get into the reflection, because we want our participants to see how they can begin to start applying some of these tools.
All right. So here we go. I'm going to select a slightly less enthusiastic reflection score for us. But what I'd love for you to consider are the following questions. Of the three phases of an assessment plan, pre, concurrent, and post-program, which would you most want to improve or build out? And just as you've been sitting through the session so far, how would you use a comprehensive data from a comprehensive assessment plan to tell a story about your programs? So you're just gonna, we'll take 2 to 3 minutes right now to assess that, and then we're gonna do our breakout groups. As we were looking through, just glancing through some of y'all's contributions, these are some of the themes that we noticed. I'll just start with our first one, seeing a lot of conversation around faculty-led trips, how to manage that, especially when faculty are in different divisions, or faculty don't necessarily have the same attunement to what your needs are in assessment rather than course needs. So that seemed like a common theme.
Yeah, which is great, because we're going to be talking more about faculty-led evaluations a little bit later this afternoon, or morning if you're in Pacific time. But the next part of our sessions after the break. I also saw that about using pre-assessment to get a benchmark, which is great, because not everyone is doing that. So just adding that is a small step, but it really could yield a lot, because you can really show the growth. And I also, we don't have it captured here, but I noticed that people want to capture that growth and then share it with others, like senior leadership at their college or university.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We're also seeing that a number of institutions are working with a lot of information. So there's a question of like, how are we even going to process that amount of information? Which is a very real question. And I think, we'll talk a little bit about ways to move through that data. I think something that was helpful that Roberto mentioned earlier was thinking about sort of the unexpected partnerships that might pop up, especially when I was in DSO land in ISSS, I had a student approach saying, I know we don't have Synapsis or Teradata or like the big systems, but I'm doing this project in my programming class. Can I help you come up with an internal system for sorting your advising data? And it was a very neat opportunity to collaborate with somebody. I'm not exactly sure if we went through with that project in its fullness just because of student data, but there are opportunities for crunching numbers. You might have a very enthusiastic set of student workers who really just want to learn how to Excel better, which is always a great life skill. So, how are you maybe utilizing the folks who might be in your office in different capacities to, even if it's just go through all these notes and code these particular themes and lift out those numbers out of these pre-departure advising meetings? It's one small way to start chipping away at some of that information is absolutely utilizing if you have student workers or interns working in your office or graduate assistants.
I noticed the next couple of themes that we've captured here is that people are interested in using some concurrent program assessment to really show the academic and non-academic learning, and so that the program doesn't just seem like a trip, like a leisurely or a tourism type experience. So making sure that the academic is there as well as a non-academic part that may seem very glamorous in a or glossy in a brochure. And along with that is just highlighting, coupling that academic outcomes with experiential learning and using assignments to capture that. I think that we have to be hyper aware when we're assigning something to students that is for a grade, that they aren't just telling us what what we want to hear, but maybe try to structure it or design it in a way that is allows for some type of authentic responses from the students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if you wanted to take a glance, of course, through our slides again, you can always check out that link and see what other groups had to contribute. I love all of these reflections that were brought up in the discussion, and I think I'll take us through to our last sort of conclusions conversation.
Yeah, so we're wrapping up, as Gabe says, we're wrapping up this first session, and we have a few points here that we want to highlight about, for starting off with learning outcomes aligned with institutional goals and mission. I mean, this is, as I said before, we're all connected to educational institutions, so really this is the way, this is like so fundamental. And again, repeating about our comprehensive assessment plan and the different elements, we want to be very deliberate about that, how we organize a plan, mixing and matching different assessment tools and throughout the program, not just at the end, and involving our students. So making them part of the process so that their experience with learning is more purposeful and they're aware of it. So the last point we have is about data and telling compelling stories to different audiences. So we were asking the why of including a specific assessment tool, but we also consider the who, our specific audiences, and what data and presentation would engage them. Some of you have talked about, when you were in your breakout rooms, about reporting to senior leadership, and that's great. You'll be using data, presenting it in a very specific way, a different way than you would, for example, in obviously a brochure or website or to students. So I'd like Gabe also to chime in here, but just the way I think of this overall goal here is for you to take more control of your own assessment strategy, and not for the assessment to take on the role of an external judge. Your programs are not on trial, but to gather data to promote, to be more proactive about program growth, development, expansion. And we're all really interested in hearing, how it goes for you. We'll talk a little bit more about next steps before the next session in May, but we are, very, very committed to, keeping in touch and hearing more about how you implement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I really appreciate sort of you framing it that way, Roberto, with like this is all for the overall goal of growth, both for your own programs and ultimately, for the students that we're all serving. I think that there are ultimately, like, especially when we're thinking about improving sort of diversity broadly in our study abroad programs, it's so important to think new even for folks who have a lot of assessment tools, it's always great to look back and say, what exactly are we measuring here? Are we capturing the nuances of our student experiences? And instead of, I did see some concern about, don't want to put more on the students. That's totally fair. How are you looping in, like I said, like program leaders, site supervisors, how are you possibly integrating with, if you're sending students to a branch campus for another type of exchange, like how are you, being attuned to what's happening at that institution already. I think there are lots of opportunities to be creative with fewer resources. I think we all resonated with the single person office that was elevated in the slides that were coming up. I was like, oh, yep, definitely been there. So I think that there are lots of ways to be strategic with what you're already working with. Something else that I really wanted to think about is really expanding that notion of like student learning, and I think that can really just benefit so many of our participants. There are a number of orgs that work with groups to have a more holistic understanding of identity-based experiences abroad. I know, of course, there's diversity abroad, which is sort of the big one. But there are so many programs that you can collaborate with that either serve specifically or support institutions that are trying to strategize for more inclusive practices. So, of course, we have ideas. There are, if you go to any given conference, once we're all able to do that again in person, it's always great to maybe this is a part where you do, instead of necessarily adding more things, we're also at the core of this process, right? So what are you doing next time you have an opportunity to go to a conference or learning space? Are you going to prioritize going to a session on diversity abroad? Making sure that you slate that into, you or someone from your office goes to at least one a year. There are so many levels to just start building out your own capacity, even if it's you as an individual person in your office. It doesn't necessarily have to be, let's add 30,000 new assessment tools. It can be like, wait, let me make sure I'm grounded in my understanding of assessment and what it can do. So, that's also why it's so great to see everybody here having that conversation. Is there anything else that would be helpful to note or talk about?
I would like to just say, our next slide lists some of the sources that we drew from to prepare this presentation. We also have handouts that we're going to give that are related to this session about student learning outcomes. One of the handouts will be offering a step-by-step process on just building out, how do you write your student learning outcomes, and with some different examples. And then just the other has a step-by-step of just taking you through developing your learning assessment strategy, and how you could go about that. It also gives a little bit more information about assessment tools, some of the ones that we've seen here. But in general, we have just a few minutes left. I don't know if you want to add anything, Gabe, but we want to also just give our participants a little bit more information about what's going to happen in the next session.
Absolutely. Well, I think that, there's so much to mull over in the slides that we've collected over the course of the day. If there are things that you would like to add that maybe you didn't have a chance to because the infamous Zoom breakout room timer just cut you off, please feel free to check those slides out.